Well, thank you so much. It's always good to be in Hong Kong. Thanks for the center, to Ryan, to Grace for so adeptly organizing this. I've been told that there's always an early lunch, so I hope what I have to talk about will not put you back to sleep. It's going to, if anything, the macabre quality of this would keep you awake, or I hope. Thanks. In June 2023, last year, the governments of Pakistan and Bangladesh expressed formal disapproval with the mural that was unveiled in the newly constructed Parliament of India. The mural was of an anachronistic map. The cause of much controversy was that this map included Pakistan as well as Bangladesh as India. You can see the scars of partition sutured around, but it was all included as India. So in response to the dismay of both Pakistan and Bangladesh, the Union Parliamentary Affairs Minister retorted that our resolve is clear. What we hope for is Akhand Bharat, which is a bellicose Hindutva historical idea of a unified greater India. In effect, what the mural did was it negated the lines of partition. The scars remain, but negated and established an earlier form of what India was. As this instance indicates, there exists a persisting anxiety in the Indian collective sphere, a cartographic anxiety, which goes back to the foundational moment of the Indian nation state. I argue that this anxiety emerges from a primordial dread of the body in fragmentation, of a generative phantasmagoria that constitutes the psychic subjectivity of the individual as much as it shapes constitutional doctrines. Once we see this image, if I can ask you to look at this closely, what is the most striking quality of this image, do you think? Venture, any guesses? The face? Anything else? It's that extra leg at the back. An extra leg at the back? Is the skin intact? Is the body being ruptured, flown apart? In a crucial sense, this points back to a central idea that is foundational to psychoanalytic thought, that the body always begins with a certain sense of a fragmentation. And it is by realizing and repressing the fragmentation of the body as an unconscious thought, as an unconscious idea, that we get a certain subjectivity. I'll come back to this particular idea of phantasmagoria. But before that, I want to talk a bit more about space and how we can perceive the idea of space. Apprehension of space necessitates narrativity. To understand space, to understand how we can organize space and coordinate space, we need to fold it into a particular narrative. So to delimit space and to convert it into place, maps initiate the calcification of textually drawn lines into rigid boundaries. On the left, you have a textually drawn line on a map. On the right is a satellite image of lights reflecting off the very same line. This is very much in accord with cartographic discourse, which looks at delimitation as a process that always precedes demarcation. Delimitation as textual inscription, preceding demarcation as physical inscription on the land. As opposed to being an innocuous cartographic routine, the induration of these paper lines are integral parts of a highly coordinated and ideologically suffused political process. Because if we left to itself, the earth has no political form, right? And so maps not just represent boundaries, but they create boundaries through its textual inscription. The lifelines of the map lines become the prelude to the biographical narrative of the nation, the aleph points that agglomerate into notions of beginning and belonging. Despite grand institutional ways of thinking about space, British colonial maps were insufficient to usher in native obedience. They were often void of human traces and visually empty, and they severed ties between individuals and land, locals and locales, and habitats and places within. This is a very famous map of 1842, a map published by the Society for the Useful Dissemination of Knowledge. And an interesting thing about this map is it shows the functional space of Calcutta. You have a listing of the churches and the chapels, the government houses, the courts, and the mansions. But almost in all the vignettes that you see here, the Indian laborers are always outside the functional area of the city. They are extruded outside, pushed outside the functional area of the city, so as to show that the functional area of the town, which were more often not shown in a traditional cartographic way by British colonial maps, was not that belonging to the native subject. So in constructing the geo-body of India, colonial maps simultaneously precluded indigenous claims and autochthonous attachments. This was a much earlier map of Bengal, 1780, the Atlas of Bengal, and almost 50 years before sovereignty of Bengal was, through the Charter Act brought by the British. The map already claimed that Bengal is under the sovereignty of the British nation, thanks to the efforts of Lord Robert Clive. So maps became a sustained form to preclude indigenous claims, and so it lacked the emotive and sacral element that could provoke passions, elicit emotions, and allure affections for the native subject. There was a need for a surplus layer. There was a need for something in addition to these abstract geographical images to bind the native subjectivity. The figure of that surplus emerged through the form of Bharat Mata, Mother India, the cartographic goddess of India. It was this gendered body that became the designated vehicle in Indian modern history to relay a range of functions, including the creation of a national subjectivity and the creation of a collective identity. That it was a form of a body that became the chosen vehicle to represent a collective identity should not be surprising, given that in the history of British constitutional thought and the history of Western thought, it was the body that often became the notion for representing collective identity. Kantorowicz's work on the king's two bodies remarkably shows how the body becomes the way in which a projection of collective can be dropped onto a single corpus. And there are much famous ways in which this is also shown. I'm sure you're familiar with The Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, where the body of the sovereign encompasses the collective body of the citizenry. Perhaps lesser famous, but equally poignant for British constitutional thought was the work of Edmund Burke, for whom the real constitution was the body. It was an organism, a human body, which is mixed of both natural and conventional behavior, a creature of biology and habit, pleasure and pain. And the body held a corresponding role in Indian constitutional or ancient thought as well, with the Purusa Sukta hymn of the Rig Veda being the very first ancient text which compared society to a giant organism, that the entire society could be congealed into the idea of a body and which works a harmonious unity. So body as a concept for social organization was germane to both Western thought as well as to ancient Indian thought. The construction of the political collective, not through the idea of a body, through an organicist representation, not only underscored that the body itself is political and itself implied a spatial arrangement, but also that social unification required the projected unity of a body, where various parts could come together and work as if it is a whole. Veneration and sacralization of this corporeal figure required the image of a goddess to entrench the point that the land was eternally fixed since time immemorial. And it worked as a powerful anti-colonial metaphor to claim the land against British cartographic practices. It was also a metaphor to entrench ideas of unity and integrity since time immemorial. And despite being ignored in Indian constitutional scholarship, I want to show that this is what prefigured constitutional doctrines of unity and territorial integrity. The gendered body of Bharat Mata, and it's important to notice that she stands firmly above the Indian Ocean. You have a small lotus bud near her feet representing Sri Lanka. The tresses of her hair represent Nepal. The sari itself represents the contours and outlines of the Indian territorial limits. And you have a larger than life trident to show that she may look as if she's neutral with a ruminative posture, but she is capable of striking if and when it is needed to. The idea of a gendered cartographic representation emerges from other parallels as well. You have, for instance, Europa and Britannia, who also have cartographic representations. And what emerges in the Indian context is a unique form of an imagination, which is also an exclusionary form of imagination of the land. Because one ought to realize that a question that often arises is, we have a sense of a mother India, but do we have a sense of mother Pakistan? Is there a way in which Pakistan could be represented cartographically? In my work that I've looked at, there is almost no representations of anthropomorphic ways of thinking about Pakistan because of iconoclasm. You cannot represent deities, idols. And so the very form of using deities and idols to represent entrenches a particular religious configuration of how we relate to the land. So there is an exclusionary force in the very means used to represent the land through Mother India. So Bharat Mata is a central icon of an originary plenitude, and she soon became the source of an origin myth of Indian history. She was first conceived in the late 19th century through a novel, Anand Mat, and was popularized much later through representations such as these to show that India has remained in this way since time immemorial. There are two functions achieved through such representations. On the one hand, she heralds modernity, but on the other hand, she also inscribes antiquity. You can see the accoutrements and appurtenances. There are beads, there are jewelry, there are a crown, a vermilion, the attire that she uses, all points to ideas of a traditional and antique deity guarding and embodying this patch of earth since time immemorial. And this antiqueness becomes a signifier for the antiqueness of India itself. But from its inception, there was a double movement that operated through the figure. On the one hand, there was a territorialization of history. The history of India remained circumscribed to this particular territorial limit. On the other hand, there was a historicization of territory. Within this particular limit is all the history that was born for the Indian subcontinent. The identity of India emerged from a sustained projection of this historically fixed unity, and national history became coterminous with sacral space. The visual force of Mother India beseeched attention and commanded attachment. And in the early phase of Indian nationalism, which is late 19th century, when Bharat Mata became a primordial figure for ideas of unity, she was used at once to herald an ancient past, to project a utopian future, and became a geographical synecdoche to tie both the past and the future together. And this is shown well by Bipin Chandra Pal, who argued in 1911 that our history is the sacred biography of the mother. The outsider sees her as a mere bit of earth and looks upon her only as a geographical expression, but we, her children, know her even today as our father and their fathers had done before, for countless generations, as a being, as a manifestation of Prakriti, our mother and the mother of our race. Crucial in this identification is a simultaneous suspension and extension of colonial cartographic tropes. The mother has a long history, but remains confined to the fixed outlines of a geographical expression. She is within a mere bit of earth, but she is more than that. She provides a fixed stamp of antiquity for countless generations, but her bodily limits remains tethered to the colonial production of what the territorial limits were. Sumati Ramaswamy invokes Jacques Derrida's notion of supplementarity to think about this particular operation. Supplementarity has a dual sense. The first, supplementarity supplements, it adds, and the second, supplementarity replaces, it supplants. Why supplementarity? Because despite being an anti-colonial version, the external limits of Bharat Mata is borrowed from the trigonometrical and British colonial surveys that are used. So there is an addition based on the external cartographic outlines. But evocative of the second notion of supplementarity, the internal content is replaced in Bharat Mata's configuration, as opposed to the lines of power and the grids of certitude through trig surveys and route surveys. Bharat Mata provides an alternative sacral epistemology to understand the land. So there is an addition, at the same time an internal replacement that happens, evocative of Derrida's dual notion of supplementarity. The primeval mother, through this circuitous route, inherits a dual sense of a unity. It is such a twice-born unity that was constituted of India's imagination of territorial inviolability, and which became a powerful predecessor for constitutional notion of unity and integrity. It represented the essence of India as a monadic and a unified element, irreducible, indivisible, and irreplicable. Tampering with the sacred body, tampering with the external outlines, was tantamount to deicide, tantamount to killing the goddess. But it was precisely such a rupture of a corpus, a tear of the flesh, the partition of the geobody, that not only eviscerated nationalism's underpinnings of historical unity and territorial integrity, but inaugurated the modern nation state and its constitution. The country's original sin was not in killing the primeval father, but it lay in the slaying of the mother. That the ruptured and the fragmented body, which is through the partition, was constitutive of the post-colonial condition, was disavowed no sooner than it was declared. And this becomes evident when Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, noted that partition had wreaked havoc on the administrative apparatuses, it wreaked havoc on the infrastructures, it wreaked havoc on the military capabilities when India was born as a country. But above all, what was broken up, which was of the highest importance, was something very vital, and that was the body of India, that produced tremendous consequences, not only those that you saw, but those that you cannot imagine, in the minds and the souls of millions of human beings. So communications, institutions, and infrastructures were torn asunder, but these could be revived. What could not be easily restored was the once unified corpus of the nation, the body, which had been irrevocably wrenched apart and produced unimaginable consequences in the minds and the souls of millions of human beings. The originary wound lived on in the collective psyche of the polity, with its own dynamics of anxiety and repetition. So a question that you might ask at this point is, if there is a rupture of the body that has taken place, and it was such a constitutive and such a forceful rupture, how is it that the unification, the unified sense of Mother India, continues to hold and continue to play a role in constitutional notions of unity and integrity, especially given the historical rupture? Well, the historical rupture is exactly what has been repressed in Indian constitutional history. It is the original trauma which ought not to be mentioned, and even in the visual representation of the rupture, it is rare to represent infliction of the wounds. But there are very few instances of imaginal representations of the rupture. For instance, there are two modes of how the imaginal rupture happens. The first is a way of assigning blame, assigning responsibility. You have Nehru here on the right hand with a sword, on the left hand yanking the hair of Bharat Mata, as opposed to the earlier image where she stands firmly above the ocean. She's floating uncontrollably here, as if embodied and engulfed by the chaos. Nehru's yanking the hair, representative of Kashmir, and part of her arm is being vivisected. I'm not sure if it's clear. There is a grotesque face of Jinnah trying to consume the vivisected arm, which represents Pakistan. More than Jinnah, the Sanskrit caption below castigates Nehru because it reads as total destructions caused by the evil Pandit Nehru, right? This came in a cartoon in 1947 by The Organizer, which was a magazine by the right-wing organization called RSS, which is a militarized unit of the contemporary party, the Bharatiya Janata Party. So it was an early 1947 cartoon that was published. The second form of visually engaging with the rupture was through self-inflicted wounds. Another 1947 image that came out of the Time magazine, a much more macabre form of Mother India as Kali, a visually stunning and a terrifying image where she pierces a dagger into herself, and you can see two chartreuse hues, a green mark, as opposed to the rest of India, which is yellow, as if to show that those are the infected parts of the land which needs to be cut open, which needs to be incised, and therefore a self-inflicted wound is happening. Contrasted with the earlier figure, the body of the mother here is much larger than the map itself. Kali, the black grace, the primordial force, is represented through violence and as if engulfing the entire subcontinent. By exculpating any individual responsibility, this figure captures the difficulty with assigning any concrete blame for the unquantifiable and unrestrained violence that inaugurated the two nation states. Both these figures, one assigning external blame and responsibility, and another representing self-infliction of wounds, one attributing agency and the other blurring it, embody exceptional forms of engaging with the primordial wounds, engaging with the originary trauma. For, as Christopher Penny has noted in his work, the trauma of the partition was never visually represented by the commercial picture production industry. At the point in time, there was a heavy commercial production industry for Mother India through calendar art, through stamps, through coins, and it was a huge commercial industry. But the rupture of Mother India was almost never visually represented, and this remains singular in the historical archive of Mother India. Despite the negation of this originary rupture, the traumatic tear engendered a persistent state of anxiety, what Sankaran Krishna has called as a cartographic anxiety in the life of the post-colonial nation. For Krishna, the anxiety is a symptom representative of a much larger anxiety over citizenship and notions of belonging, and cartographic anxiety is one form of the larger anxiety. It characterizes the post-colonial predicament of being forever suspended in a space between a former colony and the not yet nation. And that remains the cartographic anxiety of being in a tentative liminal zone, forever suspended there. And for Krishna, the partition inscribed into India's very genetic code a perpetual precarity over its form and its shape. It was symptomatic of a greater post-colonial anxiety. But I argue that it was not just one anxiety amongst a series of anxieties, but it was the sense in which the body was visualized as torn and fractured, as wrenched apart, that is particularly foundational for the Indian nation state. It is a creation by amputation that constituted the primordial wounding of the post-colonial nation. It was this splintered and wrenching apart that dealt the first unacceptable blow to the minds and souls of millions of Indians, as Nehru had put it. The body had to be quickly represented as unified again. The torn body could not be fathomed by the post-colonial nation. And the sacred corpus was to be represented as never having been torn. The violence was to be brushed aside, and the constitution was deployed to sustain the unity and the illusion of territorial integrity. The preamble to the Indian Constitution, among other notions of justice, equality, and liberty, also enshrined fraternity as a constitutive principle, which was sustained by assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. Shruti Kapila has recently done a wonderful work called Violent Fraternities to show how the country emerged from fratricide, but the fratricide is subdued in celebratory notions of fraternity. But the point is, in celebratory discourses and discourses about transformative constitutionalism, what is not recorded is the other scene of the constitution, which is the violence that also gave birth to it. It is present and constitutive, but not immediately accessible. For instance, when the recent Citizenship Amendment Bill was passed in India, the justification emerged that it was partition for which the citizenship bill was being passed. If there was no partition, there would be no exclusionary citizenship. So partition remains a significant notion for Indian politics and its constitutional law, although disavowed by the judiciary as well as constitutional scholarship. Fraternity after fratricide, unity after upheaval, and integrity after incision formed the legal lexicon of repression. Fraternity, unity, and integrity would reappear in the Constituent Assembly as constitutive notions to be preciously preserved. During the debates on the emergency provisions, for instance, many members of the Constituent Assembly would repeatedly recall fissiparous tendencies, internal dangers, tendency of the unit to break away, and other justifications of precarity to justify a strong central government and to justify a strong government with an emergency power where the central government can take up the control of the provincial government if the situation arises. But the mother itself, Mother India, was declared within the Constituent Assembly as having been regenerated with her bodily integrity intact. When the national flag was adopted by the Assembly, Nehru declared that this triumph of ours has been marred in many ways. We have seen parts of this dear motherland of ours cut off from the rest. Nevertheless, it is true, I think, hold it to be true, that this moment does represent a victory, a victorious conclusion, however momentary it was. The body was torn, but it had been sutured, recuperated, and restituted to its original condition. As if to clear any doubts, Sarojini Naidu, on the same day in the Constituent Assembly, declared that she's speaking on behalf of that ancient reborn mother who continues to have an undivided heart and an indivisible spirit. The ancient mother returns as a reincarnation of a former totalized self. The primary crime of matricide was precluded thereafter, with Article 3 of the Constitution bearing the mark of a retrospective taboo, given that secessions and cessions of the country were impermissible as per the Constitution. So according to Article 3, you can internally restructure the provinces, but the external outlines must remain the same. You cannot tamper with the external outlines. And as consistently held by the Supreme Court of India since the judgment of Indre Berubari Union, if a portion of the land was to be ceded to another state, it required a constitutional amendment with its tedious procedures to admit any tampering with the body. The first schedule of the Constitution, which verbally lists all the provinces of India, had to be amended and changed if the confines of the cartographic outline were to be shifted. The body of the mother had to be protected, and if at all it was to be transfigured in the exceptional situation, it could only be through the Constitution ensuring a peaceful regeneration of the mother akin to her previous rebirth. It was a Constitution in the last resort that would ensure a surgical procedure of vivisection if at all the situation demanded. That the body in fragmentation, the constitutive rupture, was quickly covered over, regenerated, and dearly protected with constitutional protocols is evocative of what Jacques Lacan has called the primordial phantasmagoria. In the earlier image, we saw a figure with skins unfolding and sitting calmly. For Lacan, in his essay on the mirror stage, the primordial dread of the infant when the infant looks at the mirror is not to fall in love with itself like Narcissus, but to placate and cover over a frightening reality of the body as first visible as alienated and disjointed. The first encounter with the mirror, as Frederick Jameson reminds us, performs an alienation before the entry into the symbolic order, before the symbolic castration that Lacan talks about. It is the mirror state that performs the first alienation and not the entry into the symbolic. And therefore, the mirror comes as a form to provide an illusion of cohesiveness. Cohesion, totality, unity, and integrity are bodily notions that are constructed out of a projected unity as seen in the mirror. The cartograph is the mirror of the nation. It is the imaged body of the nation, and in early modern literature, in multiple works of early modern literature, it is often referred to as the unmediated mirror of the earth. The cartographic imaging is the first wounding, the first distortion, the first mirror stage of a nation. Lines of a nation must join on a map, much like the image reflected in the mirror has the function of producing a perception and appearance of a totally unified body. The collective desires territorial integrity just as the subject desires bodily unity. Reiterating the rebirth of the mother in the Constituent Assembly, unharmed and unified, repressing the violent wounds becomes a way to control the original violence that affected constitutional law. When we look at constitutional doctrines of unity and integrity through these lenses, it is not just innocuous doctrinal contrivances, but as ingenious devices to protect the doubly inherited visual unity of the cartographic layout, frames to an unmediated mirror. If law is incapable and unable to grasp the original wound, literature performs that function remarkably well. Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, for instance, which follows the life of Salim Sinai, the protagonist, who was born on August 15, 1947, just as India, and who soon discovers that along with him, there are hundreds of other children who were born with telepathic connections and gifts. Sinai's narrative by Rushdie is an allegory for the political narrative of the nation, and Sinai's body becomes an allegory for the cartographic layout of the nation. And in one of the most iconic and violent scenes of the novel, we see that Sinai faces the first of many bodily mutilations. And he reflects that I am falling apart. I am beginning to crack all over. I am literally disintegrating. As Anki Mukherjee reflects, Salim Sinai's skin cracks in paranoid anticipation of the divisibility of subcontinental narrative. And in one of the most brutal scenes of the novel, when the geography instructor of Salim Sinai is explaining how Sinai's face is the map of India, he explains that the nose is the Deccan Peninsula, the left here is East Pakistan, the right is the West Pakistan. And soon after is when one of the first of many corporal punishments takes place. When Sinai was being indisciplined or was being not according to the geography instructor's expectation, Zagalo rips apart a clump of Sinai's hair, and it becomes a part of a series of violent mutilations which makes Sinai comment. I felt the patch on my head where Mr. Zagalo had created a monkish tonsure, a circle where hair would never grow again, and realized that the curse of my birth, which connected me to my country, had managed to find an unexpected expression of itself. Akin to Nehru's yanking of Bharat Mata's hair, representative of Kashmir, the ripping apart of Sinai's hair marks the first of many bodily mutilations, which include not just a tonsured head, but mutilating fingers, fissuring skin, and a disintegrating body. Tropes which Rushdie undermines the unity and illusions of cohesiveness in the Indian nation state. Rather than using the idea of a body for unification, as through Thomas Hobbes or Edmund Burke, what post-colonial novelists like Salman Rushdie, Amitav Ghosh, and James Coetzee do is to undermine notions of cohesiveness. And Rushdie is well aware of what he's looking at, because at another part in another essay, he writes that motherness, excuse me if I underline the point, is a big idea in India, maybe our biggest. The land as mother, the mother as land, and as the firm ground beneath our feet. So when Sinai's body is being disintegrated and mutilated, it is also a way to play with illusions of bodily unity, play with the illusions of totality, to show that precarity and vulnerability is an ever-present possibility, as opposed to closures of constitutional integrity. It is this potential to play with an otherwise contentious, sentimental, and deeply guarded secret that opens literature as a radical potential to suspend myths of foundation, of closure, of valorization, and sacralization. And it is a similar madness that is brought out by another novelist, by Saadat Hasan Manto, called Tauba Tek Singh, where you have an insane asylum before partition. And Tauba Tek Singh is a protagonist who has not sat down for 15 years, and he's always standing upright for 15 years. And he's very well known for asking the same question, where is Toba Tek Singh? And so when the news of partition reaches Toba Tek Singh, he becomes anxious and repeats it with even more ferocity, where is Toba Tek Singh? The day of partition comes, inmates of Hindu inmates in Pakistan are made to go to India, and Muslim inmates of India are made to go to Pakistan. They are brought to the border, and Toba Tek Singh is taken to the Indian side, and he asks the Indian officer, where is Toba Tek Singh? The Indian officer responds with a laugh, of course it's in Pakistan, and he runs to the other side. The officers in Pakistan try to catch him and push him to the other side. And he says, no, but Toba Tek Singh is in Pakistan. I need to be here. When it proved useless, he runs to the middle of the land where the boundary line was supposed to be between India and Pakistan and lay prostrate on that ground. And Manto ends his short story in this way. Behind the barbed wire on one side lay India, and behind more barbed wire on the other side lay Pakistan. In between, on a bit of earth which had no name, lay Toba Tek Singh. In ending his narrative by subsuming the identity of the individual into the liminal line of the boundary, Manto demonstrates not only the trauma inherent in the drawing of the boundary, which is an imaginary line that draws attention to itself by violence, but also the state's act of displacing the real for the imaged totality of the nation. It is also representative of a certain madness, because when Cyril Radcliffe's partition line was announced 2 days after India became independent, on the 17th of August, it was soon realized that the line of partition cut across many houses. Erstwhile neighbors immediately became adversaries, and families were designated with different nationalities. Manto's story provokes a critical engagement with the naturalized narratives of boundaries and of cartography. If the rupture of bodily unity of the national corpus, which was inherited through a doubly produced unity of colonialism as well as the sacred corpus, provided tremendous anxieties for the birth of the post-colonial nation, entrenching unity and integrity as sensitive constitutional principles, it continues to play a role in India today. The latest iteration of this anxiety is a recently passed penal code, the replacement of the colonial Indian penal code, which enshrines for the very first time endangering the unity and integrity of the country as a criminal offense. The persisting legal anxiety, now enabling the preservation of unicity through the coercive power of the state, is an emanation of the cartographic anxiety that emerges from phantasmagoric reality. Literature can be used to revitalize law's complacent illusions, and law may never be able to countenance its nightmare, but juxtaposing legal principles of certainty, its rational doctrines, with literature's radical possibility of opening might offer a way to continually stage such a confrontation. Literature here could be revitalized to destabilize law's complacency and its complicity in violence. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your patience in listening to